January 7th, 1945. The air in Belgium was biting cold, but inside the headquarters of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the atmosphere was about to become radioactive. The British commander stood before a phalanx of reporters, the microphones of the world press recording his every breath. He had called this press conference to set the record straight about the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German counteroffensive that had shattered the winter silence of the Ardennes. Montgomery intended to explain his role in stopping the German war machine, to detail how he had brought order to chaos. But as he spoke for nearly an hour, a distinct and dangerous narrative began to take shape. He repeatedly, almost rhythmically, used the phrase "I handled" when describing the complex maneuvers of the battle. With every sentence, he painted a picture that was politically explosive. The implication that American forces had been in a state of absolute disarray, leaderless and panicked, until the steady hand of British command arrived to save them. He dismissed the heroic, desperate stands made by isolated American units. He glossed over the logistical miracles performed by American suppliers. Instead, he positioned himself as the singular savior of the Western Front. It was a performance of breathtaking arrogance, and the reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. This was not just a briefing. It was a diplomatic grenade thrown into the heart of the Allied command. Within 24 hours, the shockwaves had reached the highest levels of power. General Omar Bradley, the senior American commander on the ground, was not just angry, he was humiliated. He sat at his desk drafting his resignation letter, unwilling to serve under a man who publicly mocked the sacrifice of his troops. Within 48 hours, the crisis had crossed the English Channel. Winston Churchill was scrambling, terrified that this clash of egos would shatter the Anglo-American alliance just months before victory. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, a man famous for his patience and diplomacy, had finally reached his breaking point. He sat in his office and drafted an official order relieving Montgomery of command. Consider the gravity of that moment. One press conference, 1 hour of unchecked ego, had nearly destroyed the Allied command structure. Montgomery's arrogance had brought the Western alliance to the very brink of collapse, threatening to do what Hitler's armies could not, divide the Allies. Churchill was forced to deliver an emergency speech in the House of Commons, publicly praising American bravery and sacrifice to prevent an international divorce. But beneath this storm of political drama lay a darker, more uncomfortable truth. While Montgomery was being crucified for his words, a far more deadly reality was being ignored. 4 months earlier, 2 major Allied offensives had ended in costly, bloody disasters. 2 legendary commanders had failed their men. 2 sets of tragic casualty lists had been sent to grieving families across the Atlantic. But only one commander would face the guillotine of public opinion. September 1944. Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden, a daring, high-stakes gamble to end the war by Christmas. It was a spectacular failure. In just 9 days, 17,000 Allied soldiers became casualties. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed. American generals were furious about the wasted resources, the diversion of supplies, and the loss of life. But there was no command crisis. No relief orders were drafted in Washington or London. Montgomery kept his command. His failure was viewed as a bold risk that simply didn't pay off. That same month, however, General Omar Bradley launched a different kind of offensive. He sent American troops into the Huertgen forest. This was not a bold gamble. It was a slow descent into hell. For 5 agonizing months, American divisions were fed into a meat grinder that military historians now struggle to comprehend. By January 1945, at the very moment Montgomery was holding his disastrous press conference, Bradley's offensive had consumed 33,000 American casualties. Let that number sink in. 33,000. That is nearly double what Montgomery lost at Market Garden. Entire divisions were chewed up and spat out, destroyed fighting for a dark, dense, worthless stretch of forest that offered no strategic value. It was a sector that every tactical analysis suggested should have been bypassed entirely. Yet, Bradley was never questioned. No reporters demanded his resignation. No one in the Pentagon suggested he should be fired. Eisenhower stood by his longtime friend throughout the grinding attrition, offering unwavering support. The contrast was impossible to ignore, yet it remains one of the great paradoxes of the war. Montgomery's arrogant press conference nearly ended his career. Bradley's costly, prolonged battlefield failure never put him in danger. Why? Why would Eisenhower tolerate massive, senseless battlefield casualties from his favorite commander, but nearly fire Montgomery over a speech? To understand this, we must look away from the podiums and map rooms and look into the snow-covered foxholes of the Ardennes. When the Germans launched their surprise attack in the Ardennes, the American lines were dangerously thin. The units manning this quiet sector were either inexperienced divisions fresh from the States or battered units sent there to rest and rebuild. They were under strength, exhausted, and partially equipped. They couldn't hold against the sheer weight of the desperate German assault. But why were they so weak? The answer lies in the Huertgen forest. Other divisions that might have served as mobile reserves, fresh troops that could have plugged the gaps, had been chewed up in Bradley's forest offensive. The American response to the German blitzkrieg was critically hampered by the casualties Bradley's Huertgen campaign had consumed. Bradley had no strategic reserves because he had ground them to pieces, attacking a worthless forest for months. The crisis of the Bulge was directly linked to the failure of the Huertgen. Eisenhower reacted with the speed of a man who realized the war was at stake. He sent airborne divisions to hold critical crossroads. He redirected forces from quiet sectors. But he needed a hammer. He needed a commander who could move fast, think faster, and attack decisively. He didn't call Bradley for this. He called Patton. And George S. Patton was ready. Why? Because unlike Bradley's divisions, Patton's Third Army hadn't been destroyed in a useless forest offensive. Patton had preserved his combat power, waiting for the moment to strike. December 19th, 1944. Eisenhower held an emergency meeting at Verdun. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and anxiety. He looked his commanders in the eye and asked the impossible question. How quickly could they reorient their forces to respond to the German crisis? Most generals, looking at the maps and the weather reports, said days or weeks. The situation was chaotic. The roads were iced over. Communication lines were cut. Moving large forces in winter is a logistical nightmare that usually takes weeks to organize properly. Then, Patton spoke. 48 hours, he said. The room went silent. The other generals exchanged glances. They thought he was insane, or perhaps grandstanding. Third Army was 100 miles south of the battle. Patton would have to disengage his troops from active combat with the enemy, turn an entire army of hundreds of thousands of men 90 degrees north, move them through blinding winter storms along icy, single-lane roads, and launch a coordinated attack against a dug-in enemy. Military doctrine said it couldn't be done. It was physically and logistically impossible. But Patton explained he had anticipated the need. While others were reacting, Patton had been predicting. His staff had already prepared contingency plans for moving Third Army north. He had 3 complete attack plans ready, code-named and supplied, depending on exactly where Eisenhower wanted him to strike. All he needed was the order. Eisenhower, desperate for a solution, gave it. Patton left the meeting and immediately put his plan into motion. It was a symphony of violence and logistics. Third Army began disengaging from operations in eastern France. They turned north and moved through snow and ice toward the German offensive. The trucks didn't stop. The tanks slid on the ice but kept moving. The men froze, but they marched. On December 22nd, exactly 3 days after the Verdun meeting, Patton's forces slammed into the southern flank of the German Bulge. It was one of the most impressive operational movements in the history of warfare. Patton moved 3 divisions, approximately 133,000 men, and thousands of vehicles, over 100 miles in the worst winter conditions Europe had seen in decades, and launched a coordinated attack with minimal preparation time. His forces relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne on December 26th. Inside Bastogne, the situation had been dire. The paratroopers were running out of everything but snow and courage. They had no winter clothes, their ammunition was critically low, and they were surrounded by 7 German divisions intent on wiping them out. They weren't fighting for strategy anymore. They were fighting to survive the night. When Patton's tanks finally broke through the tree line, smashing the German encirclement, the paratroopers didn't just see armor. They saw life. They saw salvation. Patton's forces drove back the Germans and eliminated the threat to the Allied front. The speed and effectiveness of this maneuver shocked everyone. German commanders, interrogating prisoners later, couldn't believe American forces could reorient so quickly. British observers, usually skeptical of American tactical skill, called it a masterpiece. Even Eisenhower admitted it was one of the war's most impressive achievements. But the brilliance of Patton's maneuver cast a harsh, unforgiving light on Bradley's performance. The contrast was stark and damning. Bradley's careful, methodical approach had ground divisions to pieces in the Huertan forest for 5 months without achieving significant objectives. Patton's aggressive, improvisational approach turned an entire army and launched a successful offensive in 3 days. This success raised uncomfortable questions that echoed through the halls of command. If Patton could move 3 divisions 100 miles and attack in 3 days, why had Bradley needed 5 months to advance 5 miles in the Huertan forest? If Patton's aggressive tactics worked so well in the crisis, why wasn't he given more authority during normal operations? Why was the plodding, costly strategy of Bradley preferred over the dynamic genius of Patton? The answer, as is so often the case in war, was political. Bradley was the GI's general. He was Eisenhower's chosen American commander, a man of calm demeanor who fit the mold of a modern professional soldier. He had to be supported to maintain the image of American competence. Patton, on the other hand, was the aggressive subordinate who had to be controlled. He was viewed as a loose cannon, a man who slapped soldiers and insulted allies. The command structure wasn't based solely on battlefield effectiveness. It was based on political reliability. Patton understood this bitter truth. He had saved the situation Eisenhower and Bradley created through their cautious strategy and intelligence failures. If he had been given the fuel and authority earlier in the fall, the Germans might not have been able to launch the offensive at all. But that is alternate history. What actually happened was that Patton's brilliance during the Bulge rescued the situation and, crucially, distracted everyone from asking why Bradley had wasted thousands of casualties in a forest that proved strategically irrelevant. Because by the time people look back, the war was nearly over. Victory has a way of obscuring mistakes. The Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied victory. The German offensive was crushed. American forces had held impossible positions and counterattacked decisively. The public celebrated Patton's dramatic relief of Bastogne. They read headlines about the 101st Airborne's heroic defense. They didn't hear much about the 33,000 casualties in the Huertan forest. The drama of the Bulge provided the perfect cover for Bradley's disaster. Public attention focused on German aggression and American resilience. The months of grinding attrition in an obscure, dark forest didn't make for good headlines. This was fortunate for Bradley. The Huertan forest casualties were buried under the snow and the drama of the Bulge. The questions about whether the forest should have been bypassed were never seriously examined by the press or the public. Compare this to Montgomery. His failure at Market Garden had been dramatic, singular, and public. 17,000 casualties in 9 days. British paratroopers surrounded and destroyed. It was a clear, undeniable failure that could be pointed to on a map. Bradley's Huertan disaster was gradual, creeping, and less visible. 33,000 casualties spread over 5 months. Multiple divisions slowly ground down rather than one airborne division spectacularly destroyed. It was a failure of attrition, one that could be obscured by subsequent events and the fog of war. Eisenhower never seriously considered firing Bradley. Despite the casualties, despite the strategic failure, despite the obvious waste of human life, the reasons were personal and political, not military. Bradley was Eisenhower's longest-serving subordinate. They had known each other since West Point. Bradley was loyal. He was the American commander Eisenhower trusted absolutely to follow orders and not create diplomatic incidents. More importantly, Bradley was Eisenhower's counterweight to Montgomery. The Allied command structure required an American general with authority and prestige equal to Montgomery's. If Eisenhower fired Bradley, he would have to promote someone else to lead the American ground forces. Patton was the obvious candidate based on skill, but Patton was politically toxic. He said offensive things. He competed with Montgomery openly. He ignored orders he disagreed with. Eisenhower could not trust Patton to play the delicate game of coalition politics. So Eisenhower kept Bradley. He accepted the Huertan casualties as the grim cost of the offensive. He didn't question whether Bradley's strategy had been sound. He simply supported his longtime friend. This was the same calculation Eisenhower had made with Montgomery after Market Garden. Political necessity outweighed military accountability, but there was a crucial difference, a line that could not be crossed. When Montgomery gave his arrogant press conference in January 1945, claiming credit for American victories during the Bulge, he committed a sin that battlefield failures never approached. He insulted the national pride of his ally. Bradley and Patton threatened to resign not because of a lost battle, but because of lost honor. Churchill had to intervene. Eisenhower drafted the relief order for Montgomery. This was something he had never even considered doing to Bradley, even as the body count in the forest rose. All of this happened while Huercan Forest casualties were still being counted, while American divisions were still being rebuilt after being destroyed in Bradley's offensive. The double standard was blindingly clear. Battlefield failure from a trusted friend was acceptable. Political failure from an arrogant ally was nearly fatal. Montgomery nearly lost his command not for 17,000 battlefield casualties, but for words spoken into a microphone. Bradley kept his command despite 33,000 casualties because Eisenhower protected him. This wasn't about military merit. It was about political necessity. Eisenhower needed Bradley as his American commander to balance the British. Firing him would have required admitting the Huercan strategy was wrong, admitting that thousands had died for a mistake, and creating a command crisis in the middle of the war. So Bradley was protected. The casualties were explained away as the cost of difficult terrain and determined enemy resistance. The strategic questions were never asked. An American family received telegrams saying their sons died heroes, which was true, but not the complete truth. The Huercan Forest offensive officially ended in February 1945. By then, the Battle of the Bulge had overshadowed it completely. The forest had been taken after 5 months of combat. The final tally was sickening. Final American casualties, 33,000. German casualties, 28,000. Nearly equal losses despite American advantages in numbers, air power, and artillery. The defenders had won the attrition battle. Military historians would later call it one of the worst American tactical decisions of World War II. The forest should have been bypassed. The dams, the alleged objective, could have been destroyed by air power. Months of attrition achieved nothing that mobile warfare couldn't have accomplished faster and cheaper. But the official histories wrote immediately after the war minimized the disaster. They acknowledged heavy casualties, but framed them as inevitable costs of fighting in difficult terrain. They didn't question whether the offensive should have been fought at all. Germany surrendered, May 8th, 1945. The war was over. Eisenhower was celebrated as the architect of victory. Bradley was promoted to 4-star general. Montgomery was made a field marshal. The official narrative was one of successful coalition warfare. Disputes and difficulties were minimized. The emphasis was on unity and shared victory. But that narrative obscured the terrible costs. Thousands of soldiers had died in operations that were strategically questionable. Commanders had been protected from accountability based on political considerations rather than performance. The comparison between Montgomery and Bradley was buried in the ticker tape parades. Montgomery had nearly been fired for a press conference. Bradley had kept his job despite causing twice the casualties of Market Garden. The double standard was clear, but politically inconvenient to discuss. The Huercan Forest is often a footnote in American military history, overshadowed by the glory of D-Day and the drama of the Bulge. But it remains one of the costliest mistakes of the war. Bradley's reputation as a careful, competent commander remained intact. The command structure that protected him was preserved in the post-war military. Political reliability continued to be valued over battlefield innovation. The lesson that should have been learned was never learned. Future commanders weren't taught to question frontal assaults into defended terrain if the politics demanded action. The importance of bypassing enemy strongpoints wasn't emphasized enough. This would have dire consequences in future wars. Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts would see similar patterns emerge. Questionable strategic decisions, heavy casualties for limited gains, and political considerations preventing true accountability. 33,000 telegrams meant 33,000 mothers collapsed in hallways across America. 33,000 empty chairs at Christmas dinner. Just a few weeks later, they were told their sons fell defeating tyranny. They weren't told their sons died in a forest that their own generals knew was worthless. This was true, they did die defeating tyranny. But it wasn't the complete truth. The complete truth was that they died in a forest that should have been bypassed. They died because a commander refused to change strategy when it was clearly failing, succumbing to the sunk cost fallacy. They died because the political leadership refused to hold that commander accountable for his mistakes. Montgomery lost 17,000 men in a failed operation and kept his job. Then he gave one arrogant press conference and nearly got fired. Bradley lost 33,000 men in a failed operation and was promoted. The double standard was real. The political calculations were cold and clear, and American soldiers paid the price. In the end, the lesson is brutal and simple. In coalition warfare, you can lose an army and keep your job, as long as you don't lose your temper at a press conference. Political reliability matters more than battlefield results. Personal relationships protect more than performance, and soldiers pay for decisions made by commanders who are shielded from the consequences. That's the truth about the Huercan Forest, about Bradley and Montgomery, about Eisenhower's protection of his favorite commander, and that's a truth that military histories prefer not to examine too closely, because it would require admitting that sometimes, in the grim calculus of war, politics costs more lives than enemy action. The trees of the Huercan have grown back, covering the scars of the earth, but the scars on the history of command remain, a silent testament to the 33,000 men who walked into the green hell and never walked out.